Ahora vamos a presentar a nuestra siguiente participante, Delia Warren, de la empresa Xodus. Delia, I'm going to be switching between English and Spanish just to read your bio in Spanish and then I'll cue you up.
No problem.
Delia trabaja en la empresa Xodus Group, es Lead Renewables Consultant del equipo de Renovables. Empezó su carrera como ingeniera estructural en el sector petrolero, trabajando en Escocia, Francia y Canadá. Después de más de 7 años en este rol, Delia obtuvo un MBA y decidió cambiar de industria y empezó a trabajar directamente en el sector de renovables. Entonces, creemos que es un perfil muy interesante para esta sesión. Su experiencia técnica en diseños para proyectos en alta mar ha sido crucial en su rol en Xodus, donde se especializa en la evaluación de la cadena de suministro y fuerza laboral, la relación con tomadores de decisiones y realiza consultoría de entrada al mercado estadounidense para la industria energética en alta mar. Delia, it's so nice to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us and participating.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. Again, lo siento, sorry, I won't be able to do the presentation in Spanish. I'm working on it, but not quite there yet. So this presentation, today I'll be speaking about offshore wind supply chain, focusing on opportunities and challenges. It's a lot of information packed into one presentation. So bear with me and we will make the presentation available afterwards so you can spend a bit more time with it then in case there's anything you miss. So just to get started, I work for Xodus Group. I'm a lead renewables consultant. We're a global energy consultancy. So you can see our areas where we operate on this slide. We work across oil and gas and renewables, primarily offshore wind. And we also work in a lot of spaces like hydrogen, decarbonization, emissions. So this is just a bit of a snippet of where we do work. I work in our industry development team, primarily in areas of supply chain, market insights, local content, economic impacts, and workforce assessment. Again, some information on what we do: commercial, technical, and environmental support. So we work on all stages of project development for offshore wind. Today, I'm sitting in our Boston office in the United States. I'm originally from Eastern Canada, but here in our Boston office, we work primarily with offshore wind, and we've done supply chain studies all across the world. Within the US, we've done I think about 10 different states have requested supply chain studies for offshore wind. So we're going to get started. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with offshore wind. So I'm really going to start from the beginning and give some context about the industry globally. Right here, the key takeaway, this is a graph showing offshore wind development globally out to 2029 by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US. And essentially, we're looking at the current capacity, which is approaching 100 gigawatts of offshore wind, doubling in the next 5 years globally. And you can see a good part of that will be in the US, Europe, China, and then Asia Pacific, excluding China. Right now, the world leaders are China, the UK, and Germany. And with regards to supply chain, which is what we're speaking about today, leaders are primarily located in Europe. We spoke a bit about the UK supply chain just now, also Germany and Denmark and the Netherlands, as well as China, providing all types of components, vessels, subcomponents, and raw materials. Yeah, so those are the current leaders, and we'll see what happens as the global industry grows. This is just a little snapshot of the US. I give this because this is the market that I'm the most familiar with, and that is very close in proximity to Mexico. So it may have an influence on the supply chain build out. So the US currently has a small amount of offshore wind built out, but a lot is contracted to be developed. So another 15.3. The US had a 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal. However, recent political changes have kind of stymied that a little. Right now, development is taking place primarily in the Northeast and Virginia, but there are lease areas in the Gulf of Mexico where you'll be seeing both fixed bottom and floating offshore wind being developed. Currently, everything under development is fixed, but the Gulf of Mexico, the West Coast, and Hawaii will be floating offshore wind. And as I mentioned, with the political changes, there's been a pause on all leasing activity in the US, which has created a lot of uncertainty for the future of the industry. There was recently a stop work order on a big New York project that was lifted. So we are optimistic that the industry will continue to grow and develop, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so moving into the actual offshore wind industry beyond just the market forces, this is some background that is really critical to understand what goes into an offshore wind farm. So we'll start at the very beginning, fixed versus floating. On the left side of the screen there, you can see examples of fixed and floating foundations. So that's what anchors the wind turbine to the seabed. With varying types of monopiles and jackets, and then into floating, you can see semi-submersible tension leg platforms and spar buoys. Right now, floating offshore wind is significantly less commercially developed than fixed bottom, and there are no major commercial floating projects yet, but many places, including the UK, have significant aspirations to develop their floating industry. And we'll see that become more commonplace in the coming years. And then on the right is onshore. That's not quite so relevant, but just an example of the comparison of the technology. So for floating, you're looking at needing mooring lines to connect your floating foundation to the seabed, typically in excess of 60-meter water depth. And it is more expensive and logistically complicated to build offshore wind than onshore, but there are many benefits, including the larger turbine sizes, access to higher wind speeds at higher altitudes. And then again, when you're building on the water, you're not so concerned with geographic aspects like mountains and buildings and that kind of thing. Okay, moving on. So when we speak about a project, we tend to refer to its taxonomy. So this is closely aligned with the typical contracting structures that comprise supply elements for the project. So those would be products and services. And we'll talk about the contracting structures on the next slide. So as you start for a offshore wind farm, you would begin with project development activities, and we'll go into more details for each of these as we go. The next would be manufacturing and component supply, so the physical infrastructure, which we often break down into the wind turbine itself, wind turbine generator, which comprises the tower, the nacelle, and then the rotor and blades that actually generate the electricity. And then balance of plant is everything else, all the other physical infrastructure that isn't the wind turbine. So cables, foundations, substations. Following that, the next phase or package is construction, transportation, installation, and commissioning, where the actual project is installed and commissioned, up and running. Following that is the longest time period, the operations and maintenance phase, where regular and unplanned maintenance, component replacement, and then general everyday operations of the wind farm are carried out. And then finally, we also look at sector support, and those are all of the products and services that are required for a wind farm that don't necessarily fit neatly into any of these other categories. So, things further out in the supply chain. Okay. So as I just mentioned, this is an example of the contracting structures and how they basically dictate how the supply chain is going to be built out. So as you can see here, as we go to the right towards EPCI, engineering, procurement, construction, and installation style contracting, you're going to have fewer contracts with more of the project risk being carried out by primary contractors. So this is something that you see really commonly in offshore oil and gas. It's a well-established industry. There's lots of companies that know what they're doing. So developers are confident in transferring some of that cost and schedule risk with their major contractors. So you might have a turbine package, a foundation, construction installation package, and that might include some other items, but you'll have 2 to 3 major packages. In multi-contracting, you're basically seeing a contract for each major item. So a supply station, onshore and offshore, inter-array cable, that's IAC supply and install, foundation supply, foundation install, they could all be different contracts. And in that case, the risk is really going to be on the developer. So you see that in jurisdictions and in industries where there is less experience in the supply chain, the developer there will hold more of that risk themselves and have more of an impact on the project cost and schedule. So you really need a well-experienced developer. And all of this is important, like I said, because taxonomy and contracting are critical in helping a company understand where they would fit or where they do fit in an offshore wind supply chain. Okay, so the third aspect of this that we need to discuss before we're able to fully go into a conversation about supply chain is the terminology. So some of you may be familiar with this. The owner of a project is the developer. They're the owner and operator. I know offshore oil and gas, we often refer to them as operators. But typically for offshore wind, this is up to 25 years of operations, plus 10 years of project development, plus X number of years for decommissioning. This is quite the commitment for these developers, and typically, they would be managing the entire lifetime of the project. An original equipment manufacturer, and I should state here that underneath the columns are some examples of companies that fit into those categories. An original equipment manufacturer is responsible for the production of fully assembled major components. So, the wind turbines would be produced by an OEM or original equipment manufacturer, likewise with the substructures or the foundations. A tier 1 supplier contracts directly with the project developer. Depending on who you speak with, you may also refer to a tier 1 contractor as someone that contracts directly with the OEM. Tier 2 contracts directly with tier 1, and then tier 3 contracts directly with tier 2. And as you can see, as you get further out there by tier 3, these are, a lot of raw material providers are in this tier. Okay, so now we're going to dig into each of those project development phases and discuss a little bit about what goes into the supply chain for each of those. So in the beginning, project development. So the project development phase can last, like I said, around 10 years. So they're typically, all these services, this is a service-dominated package, are procured up to 10 years before project commissioning, typically by the project developer. And they're doing things like permitting, environmental impact assessments and surveys, resource and metocean assessments, geological and geotechnical assessments, engineering and design and project management. So you'll see all of those listed as supply chain elements in the table below. And for some of these things, there is local bias preferred. So things like environmental assessment and permitting, oftentimes local companies will have an advantage here because they'll understand the processes, they'll understand the culture, and they will have experience actually doing the work in that geography. The next package is manufacturing and component supply. So this is the actual physical infrastructure, as I mentioned. So you're looking at the wind turbine, the balance of plant components, such as the cables, the foundations, that type of thing. So these are procured typically 2 to 3 years out before project construction or earlier. And a lot of them are dependent on achieving financial close. So getting full project financing, because this is a very CapEx heavy industry. A lot of components are made of steel. They're massive, massive structures. Like you can imagine, I don't know, what's an example? So say the Eiffel Tower, a lot of these wind turbines are bigger than the Eiffel Tower. So you'll see multiple structures along the horizon that are this size. So quite significant CapEx. So this is very relevant to the discussion we just had prior to this. So essentially, the developer, the OEMs, and tier 1 and 2 suppliers are all looking for subcomponents and raw materials and tools and everything that goes along with that. So you can see down in the middle here, we've got electrical equipment suppliers, minor industrial electrical equipment suppliers, blade supply, steel component supply, secondary steels. That would be things like internal structures, handrails, stairs, that kind of thing. Ancillary equipment supply, so actually heavy lift equipment, forklifts, cranes, welding supplies, corrosion protection systems, and then vessel design. There are a lot of vessels required to do these installation scopes. So that's a major consideration. Okay, so the construction, transportation, installation, and commissioning, which can be referred to in a number of different ways, but this project package is when you're actually doing the offshore installation work. So again, quite logistically complicated. Tier 1, 2, and 3 service providers are typically looking to contract here. They're the ones that are owning or operating the vessels, doing the actual installation scopes, and they'll need lots of subcontracts to get the jobs done. Primarily looking at port and marine services, marine coordination and weather forecasting, commissioning, and onshore civils and construction. You're also looking at quayside transportation and manipulation of components. So a lot of opportunities for local workforce, quayside companies, that type of thing. And they're looking for all types of offshore installation work. So any companies with experience in, for example, offshore oil and gas or workforce, and with that experience, you'd find it be very transferable to this phase of an offshore wind project. So as I mentioned before, this is also very contingent on financial support and financial decision-making being completed and approved. So you're typically looking to contract with these companies about 1 to 3 years before construction. And construction typically lasts, depending on the size of the project, 2 to 3 years, as well as the commissioning. Commissioning is basically done as you go. So again, this is quite the significant labor-intensive portion of the project. Into the operations and maintenance, there are less requirements for ongoing work and for various companies, but on as needed basis, you'll see things, for offshore inspection, maintenance, repair services, again, port and marine services. You'll have a local O&M base, but this is the duration of the project that lasts the longest, so up to 25 or more years for the project. It's a good opportunity for local companies to get stuck in because they are such long-term projects, even if there are less contracts awarded. So here again, the project developer typically manages the duration of the wind farm, although different warranty periods for physical equipment, such as the wind turbine, may mean that you're contracted with the OEM to provide maintenance work on that. It's sourced competitively, and there is definitely a local bias in operations and maintenance. Having local companies that, are close to the work site is obviously beneficial from a operational perspective, but it also creates efficiencies with regards to spending and cost. And plus, developers that set up in areas do either have a mandate or try to, out of the goodness of their hearts, employ as many local companies as possible. So this is a really good opportunity because of the fact that it's going to be there for 25 years. Okay, so next we'll go into some offshore wind market trends. And these are just observations that we've seen as the industry has kind of rolled out over the last few years. So one is supply chain clustering. So this is what we see happening when typically it's a major manufacturer moves to a region, and a bunch of supporting companies also move to that region in order to benefit from efficiencies, synergies in operations, et cetera, so that a cluster forms. And so you've seen this in, Esbjerg in Denmark, Hull in the UK. There's a lot of other examples globally. But essentially, a lot of times regions will look to get an anchor tenant, which I said is one of those major manufacturing companies. It could be a foundation company or a nacelle assembly company, and then seeing those companies come around, but it also can result from a company recognizing there's already a cluster of supporting tier 2 and 3 companies, maybe operating in adjacent industries that could support their operations, and then they locate where the cluster already exists, and then it's kind of a snowball effect. So this is one of the things we're seeing. It may go without saying, but for offshore wind, major components need to be manufactured at quayside. They're too large to be transported over land. So you are seeing a lot of coastal manufacturing in this industry. It's just a necessity due to the size of the components. External to local supply chain. So I know it's very, very early days in Mexico's interest in developing offshore wind, but there is always a transition from external to local supply chain. Well, not always a development of a local supply chain, but you're basically going to see external companies become engaged first with partnerships and encouragement for, you know, local companies to get engaged happening with time, where the supply chain will then become more local. So it's best if this can be done intentionally. Obviously, you want to get as much benefit for local companies as possible. So early in project development or in industry development, doing things like this, meeting with industry organizations like Scottish Development, it's a great way of getting the foundations in place early on for eventual local supply chain development. Adjacent industries and timeline challenges. So I mentioned previously that an offshore wind farm typically takes about 10 years from acquiring a lease until having a fully commissioned project. And that can be even longer for, you know, jurisdictions that are new to the industry, where they're trying to set up those regulatory processes, et cetera. So this is a great way to really leverage companies that may be more experienced in longer term industries like offshore oil and gas, to provide support for less experienced companies that may be looking to join the offshore wind industry. You see a lot of the names in that supply chain, excuse me, terminology slide I showed earlier. A lot of the companies have transitioned from offshore oil and gas. So you are seeing a lot of the developers even being oil and gas companies. So yes, leveraging adjacent industries is a great way to build local content. These companies obviously start further along than, you know, a startup company or industry entrant that has less experience in the offshore. And then finally, major infrastructure upgrades. So obviously these projects generate a lot of electricity. There are very large structures involved. So there are infrastructure upgrades that are also tend to be needed. So a strong focus on grid upgrades, substations, road access and bridges. These are things that you'll see just going along with these projects, even though the farm is located offshore. And then, you know, it's not only offshore where the opportunity is located, major onshore upgrades and enhancements need to be completed as well, as we mentioned before. So there's an opportunity for companies that basically do, you know, onshore construction, or that work in industrial electrical situations, or that do, you know, that are linesmen, to really participate just with, you know, the will and some minor upskilling in a lot of cases. Okay, and finally, we'll get to opportunities and challenges. We're just about at the end there, and I noted there's a couple questions, so I'll get to those at the end. Okay, so opportunities and challenges, and these are general. I've basically taken these from my experiences for projects across the US, but also in more experienced jurisdictions like the UK. So there are currently a fair number of supply chain bottlenecks. As I noted, the current installed capacity is looking to double in 5 years. There's been a slowdown in the US, but other sectors, other countries are really looking to promote this industry. There's a huge push in South America. Canada is ramping up their offshore wind aspirations. The UK is still, you know, full steam ahead with their offshore wind industry. There's some really exciting projects getting built out. technology being developed. It is an exciting time, but that does mean that the current manufacturing ecosystem is going to be strained to keep up with existing demands. There's already a major bottleneck in transformers and other transmission equipment. For instance, the 3-year lead time, which pushes it out beyond what typical developers are comfortable with their contracting, and could put strains on the financial close decision as well. So that is basically, there is a need for additional manufacturing globally. A lot of places are looking to locate manufacturing on their own shores. There was a major push for manufacturing in the US up until recently due to the Inflation Reduction Act funding. And now with the uncertainty in that industry, you're seeing a lot more question marks around what's actually going to get built there, but the need is still there. Moving on, so adjacency and transferability of knowledge and skills. So I alluded to this in the last slide, but there is a high degree of adjacency skills, expertise, and assets, including port space, major construction areas, et cetera, and civil and marine industrial sectors. So being educated on the opportunity, the timeline, and where your company fits at an early stage is crucial. I think I mentioned this again at the end, but there is a pretty significant onboarding for companies looking to participate, particularly in the physical infrastructure stage of this, and in the installation scopes. Arduous specification, onboarding, upskilling, credential winning. A lot of the companies require internal credentials or certifications that can take years to achieve. And then proof of financial viability, et cetera. So it can be hard to even get to the point where you're invited to respond to an RFP on a contract in this scope. So the earlier you're able to figure out where you fit and start that trek, the better. I would also recommend that any companies in Mexico that are hoping to get into a Mexican offshore wind supply chain start looking elsewhere to see how they might be able to get ahead of the game and start looking at partnership opportunities. Local content is a big one. Understanding local content is important. So when I say that, I mean contracts and jobs for local companies and people. And this is a major driver for a lot of these projects. People want, or jurisdictions want projects because they'll create economic benefits. But local content can drive up project costs and slow timelines. So there is a need to understand how these factors come into balance and then create partnerships to really make sure that you're getting the optimum situation. As I said before, most of the opportunities will be at the tier 2 level and beyond, and companies need to know who to contract and partner with. And I loved the I forget what it was called, but meet the supplier, the events that the previous speaker mentioned are executed by UKF, and I love that it's a way to kind of build that supply chain opportunity. So you're seeing a lot of programs like that are really successful, and it's great that they're happening. And then I mentioned previously as well, it takes about 10 years to get a project from initial leasing to spinning blades. And companies need to be familiar with these timelines to know when to be ready, not to be ready too soon or too late, to know, they may have to spin their wheels for a couple of years until financing goes through, and understand, is that something my company is capable of doing? Do we have the, the revenue streams to be able to support that type of operation? So it's important to understand that and to know what you're getting into. It's not a quick turnaround type of a business. And here I've just included this for folks to peruse after the presentations are over today. These are what we have identified as strong local opportunities in areas that have no offshore wind experience. And these are companies that can basically get up and running pretty quickly. And it gives you some insight into the supply chain requirements in each package. Okay, so like I said, I know that was a lot of information. Maybe too much for one sitting, but hopefully you all got a little bit of a benefit out of it. And now I'll stop sharing the presentation. Please feel free to reach out for any additional questions you may have. And I think we've got some time for additional questions. So thank you all very much. Again, apologies. Maybe next time I'll be able to do the presentation in Spanish, but today it had to be English. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Delia. It was really, really interesting. Appreciate the time and all the information that you managed to include in your presentation in almost 40 minutes. It was a lot, but thank you a lot. We do have a couple of questions. We can answer a couple of them, and in case we don't have enough time, we can also send them over, and you can share a written response, or they can reach out directly to you. So the first one is, what is, in your experience, the minimum size in gigawatts capacity of an offshore wind round that can attract the interest of OEMs and tier one firms to invest in local supply chain development?
Sure, I can answer that one. So I'm not sure necessarily. So there's two basic rounds you could be referring to. There's the leasing round, and then there's the actual offtake round, and this is done differently in different jurisdictions all over the world. So I'll speak to what I'm most familiar with, which is the US. So we've seen, and I think when we're talking about supply chain development, it's probably better to speak about the offtake rounds, where developers are basically, they have lease areas and they're looking to sell that electricity back to shore. I have seen, lease rounds that are like less than a gigawatt that have been successful. And, a lot of the, with the exception of the major New York auction that they recently did, or the solicitation for offtake, there have been many. But I mean, you're often seeing, 1.4 or under 2 gigawatts being offered at a time, with projects that are typically encouraged to be, at least 400 megawatts each at this stage in the US. So there is a broad spectrum. In terms of a minimum size that would be attractive, I mean, like I said, less than a gigawatt is certainly attractive to a lot of developers, depending on the lease area or the jurisdiction that they're representing. I know right now, in terms of attracting interest for OEMs and developers just to get to a region for say leasing, one study we recently did was in Atlantic Canada, and the government of Nova Scotia, which is a Canadian province, has set a target of 5 gigawatts. And I think they're looking to offer around 2 in their first instance, 2 gigawatts. And people are saying, that's great, but we kind of want to see more than 5 gigawatts as your target, to see that pipeline, to get that momentum going. So yeah, you kind of need to look at not just the interest in that round, but then overall, is there a commitment in that country to develop larger amounts?
Perfect.
I don't know if I answered that or not. Sorry.
No, you did. I think we have this idea that we need to have like very large projects to attract interest of developers, and it's interesting to see that in other parts of the world the size of the project is not as important as as you mentioned, the leasing space and having the offtake already.
Yeah, for sure. And especially early on, it's better to have a smaller project with less risk to work out any bugs, or see what kind of just to identify any issues earlier on. Not necessarily pilots, but smaller commercial scale projects are a great way of doing that, stress testing the early industry.
Definitely. Another question, it says, the study that Xodus made of the Atlantic Canada supply chain development seems also adequate for the Mexican context. How can a public or private entity in Mexico look for your help and for the financial support to pay for your services?
So that is referencing a supply chain study we did for the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces recently, which is available online for free from Marine Renewables Canada, if anybody would like to take a deeper look. And essentially, there is a really good analog to Mexico, I think. I think we'd find very similar results in a lot of ways, depending on what region we looked at. But basically, when we do our supply chain studies, it's typically either a economic development organization or an industry organization. So, you know, an organization that looks at marine renewables, that looks at green energy or decarbonization, that is looking at, you know, energy diversity, that is able to obtain funding. Primarily in early days, that funding is almost exclusively government funding. So you'd have to look at a government entity that has funding available to do those types of studies. Further on, when the industry is kind of more developed and up and running, developers will often fund studies like this to help them make decisions about what they can invest in or what they'll get the most benefit from investing in locally. So they'll get us to do supply chain studies to help them identify local content and then perform economic impact assessments to determine what is that impact going to be, how many people will we put to work, you know, should we build this type of factory or this type of factory, which one will be more advantageous. So, you know, essentially, those are the primary pathways that we've seen in terms of doing this work. So I'm not sure, maybe Gabriella or you know, your colleagues may be able to offer some more advice there, but that's what we see typically.
Okay, no, that's great. And as we've discussed in many of these sessions, the first step has to come from government, and you know, have this initiative and this interest in developing this industry, so we can, you know, reach out to companies like Xodus and develop this initial work. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question is, which incentives are, in your experience, more effective to promote local supply chains?
So on the large scale, infrastructure incentive programs, so things like the IRA, and there are similar programs like that in Canada that are making it really attractive to set up manufacturing. Those are the big ones. So those are for the high capex, you know, high cost of setup, high cost of workforce, manufacturing operations. I mean, that is just what developers and OEMs want to see, is that government matching of funds. That's been really effective in getting local supply chain building. One thing that has been a bit questioned a little bit with regards to its efficacy is linking supply chain development to offtake solicitations. So developers have been asked to come up with local content plans or supply chain investment plans that are tied to projects. And while that can be really great in getting, you know, new activity located in a region, it can also put pressure on the costs for the project, which makes the project less attractive. And then if something happens with the project and the project isn't able to proceed, then the associated manufacturing also isn't able to proceed. So we've seen that in a couple different projects in New York, where there were plans to build plants, and then the projects needed to be rebid, and then the manufacturing then fell out of the question as well. So that can be really challenging. Local incentives, so, you know, matching funds for things like port upgrades. I mean, port upgrades are huge for this industry. It's almost always a requirement. But getting the local government funding for those is often really beneficial, because the you know, the state or province can really manage that build out locally and get a lot of local benefit from that, not just from the wind industry. That's all I can really think of at the top of my head, off the top of my head. But incentives do work for sure, especially, you know, it's a competitive global market. So any place you can get an advantage will help.
Thanks. And we have another question. It's not so much of a question. Giovanna says she's working for a Mexican company looking to develop offshore energy, and are looking at different manufacturers and suppliers. She's trying to get in touch with a couple of them. Giovanna, we can help you from the embassy side to that. If it's okay with you, we can reach out to you directly after this session. And a last question from me, Delia. We've spoken in the past about countries that have offshore wind capabilities and how they can offshore oil and gas capabilities and the possibility of them transitioning in your experience and for what you've seen in your work in the US and in Canada, how much of this bulk of skills is transferable to the offshore wind industry?
I mean, there's a lot that's transferable directly and with a little bit of assistance or additional certifications or scaling. But for instance, a lot of the project development work, the engineering work, early permitting will be very, very similar to something you'll see in offshore oil and gas. The workforce is very, very similar. They'll be working with different structures, but as somebody that has worked in offshore oil and gas before, you show up and you do your work and you look at your technical drawing and you do what it says to do. It's the same for workers in this industry. You do your installation scope, just like it's been designed, and very minimal differences other than the scale of the components. For vessel crews, I mean, if you're just operating a vessel day to day, no difference at all. A lot of the support services, HSE, etc. There is specialized training for a lot of the installation activities and the commissioning activities. So you would need to do either, training specifically with that OEM or a specific program. A lot of companies partner with local training institutions to offer those training specifically. And that's a really great way to build the industry early on. I'll just throw that out there, is having local educational institutions becoming aware of the opportunities and the requirements. And then, with regards to things like quayside support and secondary steel and all the different things that local companies can do further out in the supply chain, very general services and supplies like fuel bunkering and crane operating. And I mean, I'm not saying this is simple necessarily, but things that are more commonly seen on the quayside. I mean, very, very similar to what you will be needing in offshore wind. So I just recommend for these companies that have that interest, the first thing you should probably look at are the certifications that you'll need, because they may take the longest to obtain. And then just get educated on, what similar companies have done in the past to transition into the industry. We've done a bunch of market entry studies with oil and gas companies in various aspects of the industry to help them identify where they'd be best placed in offshore wind. It's basically a matter of just making the contacts and getting the certifications in place. Those are the biggest impediments to entering the industry.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Delia. It was a real pleasure having you with us today. Thank you so much for your information, for the time. And we'll be sharing your presentation with not only the people that attended the session, but all the people that registered, so they can also reach out in case they want to speak with you a bit more.
Thanks again.
Thank you. So switching back to Spanish, Guillermo, ¿quieres cerrar la sesión?
Muchas gracias, Delia, por compartirnos tu experiencia. Muy interesante. ¿Hay algunas preguntas más de alguna empresa mexicana que le interesa establecer contacto con ustedes? Vamos a facilitar esa comunicación. Invitar, antes de cerrar esta transmisión, para una cuarta sesión que no estaba programada originalmente, que realizaremos el próximo martes 3 de junio. Tenemos una propuesta del equipo de Carbon Trust que ha estado acompañando el desarrollo de este foro. Ellos van a compartirnos en la próxima sesión algunos ejemplos en su experiencia global de cómo se pueden construir alianzas con el sector privado y trabajar de la mano con gobiernos locales para impulsar el desarrollo de la industria eólica costa afuera. Es de particular relevancia para los propósitos de este foro. Y también tendremos la oportunidad de presentar a ustedes las razones por las cuales identificamos que el desarrollo de la industria de energía eólica costa afuera Es una gran oportunidad para el desarrollo industrial en el sur-sureste, además de la contribución que tiene esto en la estrategia de transición energética. Entonces, el próximo martes, de nuevo, 9 de la mañana, con el mismo enlace de transmisión que hemos utilizado para la sesión. Esperamos verles de nuevo para esta sesión. Muchas gracias a todas y todos por sumarse a esta iniciativa.